Welcome to my first lecture about the life and times of Jesus. This set of lectures will move us out of the orbit of the Hebrew Bible and into the realm of the New Testament, the books of Christian scripture. Of course, the two are closely related. Time and again, the evangelists, and particularly Matthew, will hark back to the Hebrew Bible in search of texts that prophesy the coming of Jesus as the Messiah. But in and of themselves, the Gospels form a separate canon, and it's perhaps useful to see how these narratives developed and what unique perspectives they bring to the story of Jesus. But before we do that, it's also important to recognize that the story unfolds in Galilee in the north, as well as Judea in the south. Now, for us, that's hardly a distinction, right? They're part of the Holy Land, and today a bus can take you from Jerusalem to the Sea of Galilee in less than 2 hours, depending on traffic. But of course, it was very different in the time of Jesus. As we've seen, Galilee and the northern kingdom were separate from Judea during the period of the Israelite monarchy, and that split was sustained during the subsequent Assyrian, Persian, and Greek periods. Galilee was an outlier, high in the north, surrounded by foreign territory. When Cyrus the Great granted Judah or Yehud a measure of autonomy, he specifically omitted Galilee, which remained a Persian province. Galilee was first depopulated and then colonized by settlers from around the Middle East. As a result, it became a place of many foreign peoples, whereas Judea maintained its character as a Jewish nation. Indeed, when the Maccabean revolt liberated Judea, Galilee remained a mostly foreign territory and a rural backwater. It took another 40 years before the region was finally incorporated into the Hasmonean kingdom. But even then, suspicions ran rife. So much foreign blood had been intermingled with Jewish blood. And this is reflected in the Gospels. Remember, in John's Gospel, someone asks, "How can the Messiah come from Galilee?" He must obviously come from Bethlehem, for the Messiah, we are told, must be of the Davidic line. So why would anyone suggest that he would be coming from a small village like Nazareth? In that same gospel, it's Nathanael who says, when he hears about Jesus' place of origin, "Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth?" So there were deep social tensions between Judeans, who considered themselves the pure strain of Judaism, and Galileans, who had suffered so much from foreign infiltration. And you only have to take a look at the map to see that, indeed, Galilee was surrounded by foreign nations. To the west was Phoenicia, to the north was Syria, and to the east lay the territory of Nabatea, today's Jordan. And that is actually reflected in the name of Galilee itself. HaGalil, a shortening of the Hebrew Galil HaGoyim, means circle of peoples. All of these nations were thoroughly Hellenized, meaning that they had fully embraced Greco-Roman culture. Galilee was a beautiful land, a land of bountiful cultivation that produced a whole range of crops, from cereals to fruits and vegetables. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus said that almost everyone in Galilee was involved in agriculture in one way or another. And you only have to travel through Galilee today to see that is certainly true. Fortunately, there is no high-rise development around the Sea of Galilee, or indeed any development at all, except in the lakeshore town of Tiberias. There are few, if any, power lines, and roads are limited. That is why, for so many people, walking through Galilee is such a deep spiritual experience. To stand at the shore of the Sea of Galilee, or on the Mount of Beatitudes, where Jesus gave his great sermon, is to really imagine what it was like to live in the first century and to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. Beautiful, isn't it? Every time I go to Galilee, I'm always moved and humbled to see and touch the places that would frame the days of his ministry. But here is a key question. How did the stories of the Gospels originate? How were these narratives communicated across the first decades after the ministry of Jesus? Here, once again, we must credit the power of oral traditions. Just as the great books of the Hebrew Bible were told from generation to generation by elders sitting around a campfire at night, so too that the Gospels originate based on oral traditions about the rabbi from Nazareth, the Prince of Peace. Of course, as scholars, we sometimes have different ideas about these origins than what church tradition tells us. For example, one tradition holds that the author of Matthew's Gospel was Matthew the tax collector, who knew Jesus firsthand. Some believe that Luke and John were also members of Jesus's or Paul's entourage. It's a wonderful idea, the idea that the evangelists were eyewitnesses, the reporters on the scene, so to speak. Unfortunately, historical analysis has shown that this is unlikely, and there are many reasons for that. First, the Gospels are explicit about the fact that the disciples of Jesus were blue-collar workers. They were Galilean fishermen. It's extremely unlikely that any of them knew how to read, let alone write, which were two very different skill sets in antiquity. Second, as we saw, the evangelists wrote in Koine Greek rather than the Aramaic that Jesus and his disciples spoke. Third, the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John are clearly written by educated folks, by intellectuals, people who had been trained in Greek history writing and knew how to develop a compelling story based on the available sources. And finally, and this is the most important thing, there are many differences between the gospel stories. That is hard to explain if we think that the evangelists were eyewitnesses. It is far more likely that the gospel material is different precisely because they are based on many different oral and written traditions about Jesus that were circulating in the Roman Empire at that time. Now, I want to be clear that this does not rule out the possibility that some of these oral strands originated within the circle of the apostles themselves. That is actually very likely. The Gospel of John, for example, says that his story is based on testimony by a disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. So then, how did these Gospels develop? Well, one very plausible hypothesis that I describe in my book goes as follows. For the first 2 decades after the ministry, which is probably ended in 30 or 33 AD, many different oral traditions circulated about Jesus. Then in the mid-50s of the first century, the first documents of Christianity were committed to paper. And, this may surprise you, they are the letters of Paul. Some are written by Paul himself, while others are written under his name by his disciples. Now, these letters don't provide much biographical information about Jesus because Paul never met Jesus in the flesh, much to his regret. But they do provide a lot of information about how Paul shaped the message of Jesus' ministry for his audience, which were not only Jews, but also Gentiles outside of Roman Judea. We will see much more about that in my final lecture. Around that time, And perhaps as a result of the missionary activity of Paul and many others, the oral traditions about Jesus himself were then committed to paper. We call such papers sayings documents, and they were a very well-known format in antiquity. In essence, what these documents did was to record significant statements by a prominent sage or philosopher. We have seen how since Babylonian times, kings had their statements carved on stelae, on prisms or cylinders. But in the classical age, that ability was also extended to prominent people who obviously made an impact with their teachings. For example, we only know about the Greek philosopher Socrates through the writings of a disciple, Plato. Without those documents, we would have never known that Socrates even existed. Similar, the oldest sources about the Buddha date from the 3rd century BC, some 200 years after his life. So you see, it was very rare for a person who wasn't a king or an emperor, or who wasn't wealthy, to leave a contemporary record. Well, yes, Cicero did, because he was a senator and he could afford a personal assistant. And yes, so did the prophet Jeremiah, who had a secretary named Baruch. But then again, Jeremiah's ministry lasted a very long time, as much as 50 years, and Baruch himself was an aristocrat of independent means. No such figure operated in Jesus' circle that we know of. Therefore, it was up to the oral traditions to sustain the memory of his life and deeds. And then, in the 50s, as his fame continued to spread, these first sayings documents were written. There are several that we know of, or that we think we know of. Now, I must admit, I am in the minority here, but I believe that one of these documents, the so-called Gospel of Thomas, that is not included in the canon of the New Testament, emerged in this time frame. It's a bit of a misnomer, because the Gospel of Thomas isn't a gospel in the sense that it carries a theological message like the actual Gospels do. But it is a fascinating document because it does exactly what a sayings document is supposed to do. It lists some of Jesus' most striking statements, verbatim, without any spin, just as a court recorder would have done. Here, for example, is one such quote. I'm quoting now. He said to them, "Give Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give God what belongs to God, and give me what is mine." Now, most of us will immediately recognize this quote from the Gospel of Matthew. He said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." But here in this sayings document, this quote is presented raw, if you will, without any context or an attempt at framing. This is what he said, so I wrote it down, period. If you want to know more about this fascinating document, you can easily download it for free from the internet. Just Google the Gospel of Thomas. One scholar who has examined this and other Gnostic Gospels is Elaine Pagels, and I can warmly recommend her books, including Beyond Belief, The Secret Gospel of Thomas, the book that she was working on when I met her at Princeton University. There are other sayings documents, including one that we don't actually have in hand, but that we think we are able to reconstruct. We call that document Q, based on the German word Quelle, which means source. The reason we think that this document existed is that both Luke and Matthew seem to cite from it. And so this shows that these sayings documents were crucial sources for the evangelists when they began to write their Gospels. Luke makes that explicit. He writes that his Gospel is based on accounts that were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the Word. So we should accept that the media that bridged the decades between the ministry and the first Gospels were most likely written statements based on oral traditions. Now, it's important to remember that in antiquity, you didn't sit down one day and say, okay, today I'm going to write a book. You can do that today. All it takes is your laptop and a keyboard. But writing a book in antiquity was a big deal. It took time, it took effort, and it took a lot of research, interviewing people who knew about Jesus or heard stories about him. And so you didn't do that on a whim. You did it because you were commissioned to do so, usually by a wealthy individual who could pay you. The Gospel of Luke even identifies its patron. It is the most excellent Theophilus. So most likely, the Gospels originated in distinct communities of early Christians who wanted some form of Scripture as part of their liturgy, their early celebrations of the teachings of Jesus. Now, none of this is cast in stone, for trying to identify the location of where the evangelist lived is a subject also of ongoing debate. But many scholars accept that the oldest gospel was that of Mark, a Roman scribe who probably wrote in Rome around 70 AD for a local Christian congregation. Mark's is also the shortest gospel, written in a very workmanlike Greek. Unlike Matthew, the poet, or Luke, the consummate historian, Mark gives you the facts, just the facts. Here we go. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Period. Boom. There it is. Actually, I find that very touching, that simplicity, because it reveals the very originality of his gospel, like some diamond in the rough that has yet to be polished. That also means, though, that Mark's account is probably very close to the historical Jesus, or at least to the earliest oral and written traditions that circulated about Jesus at that time. Now, why did Mark write his gospel? Why in the late 60s? I believe there was a very good reason for that. Now remember, Mark was a scribe working in Rome, in the lion's den, so to speak. And what was going on in the 60s? Well, a whole lot. First off, there was the Emperor Nero, who decided to blame the Great Fire of Rome in 64 on the Christian community. The charge was completely unfounded, but that's beside the point. As the Roman historian Tacitus wrote, Christians became a class hated for their abominations. So already, Christians were living under a cloud of suspicion. Now, we also know that the Christian community in Rome was one of the oldest groups of Christians outside of Judea, and that many of them were, in fact, Jewish. That became a problem when the Jews back in Judea rose up in revolt just 2 years after the fire in 66. And this time, it was serious. The Roman legion stationed in the region was defeated. And so the danger that all of the Near East was about to go up in flames was very real. It was so serious that in 67, Rome sent an expeditionary force commanded by one of its best generals, Vespasian. It would take him 3 years to suppress the revolt, which, as we will see, ended in the destruction of the temple. Now, imagine that you are a congregation of Christian Jews living in Rome, while all the city is in uproar over the Jews in Judea, these terrorists who must now be suppressed by sending Roman fathers, sons, and lovers overseas. It's safe to say that this was not a good time to be a Jew in Rome. I sometimes compare it to the fear that many American Muslims felt in the wake of 9/11. And so I think that these events provided the motive for this community in Rome to commission Mark to write his gospel. As we will see, Mark goes out of his way to depict Jesus as a man who does not in any way challenge the rule of Caesar. Instead, he is the Jewish Messiah who has come to redeem his people by peaceful means. Most importantly, when Mark gets to the tricky part of how Jesus was condemned to death by Rome's highest representative in the land, the prefect, Pontius Pilate, he shifts the blame away from the Romans. The people who want Jesus dead, says Mark, are the chief priests and the Jewish crowds. They force Pilate's hand. Pilate is distraught because this is not what he wants to do, to condemn an innocent man. He even defends Jesus and says, "But why? What evil has he done?" But in the end, Pilate has no choice. He must satisfy the crowd, and so he hands Jesus over to be crucified with deep regret in his heart. As we will see, that is most likely not what happened. The facts show that the historical Pilate was an incredibly cruel and deceitful man who hated the Jews and staged several massacres of innocent Jewish men, women, and children. But of course, it wouldn't do for Mark to make a Roman official the villain of the story. And so, at the very least, his version exonerated the Christian Jews in Rome. It showed that you could be a follower of Jesus and a Roman patriot at the same time. There was nothing in the movement that could be considered a threat to the Roman state. So if we accept that Mark wrote around 70 AD, then most scholars will also accept that the work of Matthew and Luke followed some 20 years later. Matthew is believed to have written his book in Damascus. The location of Luke is uncertain, but it's possible that this author wrote for a Christian community in either Asia Minor, Greece, or even Alexandria, given the elegance of his beautiful written Greek. And while all three Gospels are different in many respects, they do have many segments in common. That's because careful literary analysis has shown that both Matthew and Luke copied some 40% of their narrative from Mark. One scholar wrote that Matthew and Luke probably wrote their Gospels with Mark's book on their lap. Of course, they also used other sources, such as Q for quelle, but it explains why much of their material is so similar. And that's why scholars refer to these three Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, as the Synoptic Gospels, from the Greek word synoptikos, meaning seen together. Now, anyone who has read the Gospels will recognize that the Gospel of John is very different. It is more concerned with Jesus' theological ideas than with the details of his life. It is also a very intellectual gospel, with many compelling ideas that some of us believe are inspired by Neoplatonic thought. For that reason, it contains many long monologues that do not appear in the other Gospels. But that doesn't take away from the fact that this Gospel features some very interesting episodes, such as, for example, the wedding in Cana, that do not appear in any of the other canonical Gospels. So I think it's quite possible that John's Gospel is a parallel tradition that evolved independent of the Synoptic Gospels. In sum, we must conclude that all of the evangelists wrote outside of Roman Judea. Mark, Luke, and Matthew probably wrote for a Jewish Christian community because they assume that their audience is familiar with the Hebrew Bible. Their focus is on showing that Jesus is the Messiah, the Mashiach, the Redeemer, foretold in Hebrew Scripture. But clearly, John wrote for a Gentile Christian audience that was not familiar with either the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish law. That's why, time and again, John must explain certain Jewish customs to his readers. And that's also why his message is not that Jesus was the Messiah, a term most of his readers would not have recognized, but that he is the Son of God, the Redeemer of all humankind. And finally, this also explains why anyone who wants to know about everyday life in Galilee will not find much information in the gospel texts, simply because the evangelists didn't live there. Fortunately, that gap is filled in two ways. One, by the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote 2 books about Judea in the 1st century, an account of the Jewish war, though seen from a Roman perspective, and a later book called The History of the Jews that includes lots of important material, including passages about John the Baptist and Jesus. But above all, it is modern archaeology, including recent excavations in Galilee, that allow us to fill this gap. These discoveries give us a fascinating glimpse of what life was like in the time of Jesus, as I will show you as we take a number of trips into the Holy Land. So armed with this knowledge, let us now turn to the story of Jesus, beginning with his birth in Bethlehem.